The president bullies an intern, but ends up falling in love with her. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. May your hearts be filled with peace, your paths with purpose, and your days with joy. Let's cherish every moment, for each day is a gift waiting to unfold. Today I want to share something close to my heart. 30 years ago, on the 16th of January, I crossed paths with the most extraordinary soul. My wife, Binta Peter, a proud black woman whose love has been my anchor, my light, and my greatest treasure. She is my forever. We're so close to a dream. 10,000 followers, just 600 more to go, and we only have one day. I believe in the magic of this community, in the kindness and strength you all share. Let's make it happen for her. Let's make her smile shine even brighter. How did you enjoy the last story? Your feedback means the world to me, so drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let's begin today's journey. The West Wing corridors gleamed under the early morning light, their polished floors reflecting Megara Salome's determined stride as she followed the Secret Service agent toward her future. Her hand unconsciously smoothed the front of her charcoal grey suit, Prada, bought second-hand, but still carrying the weight of old money she didn't possess. The pearls at her throat, her mother's only inheritance, seemed to tighten with each step. "Deputy Director's office is right through here, ma'am," the agent said, his earpiece crackling with distant voices. Megara squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of history press against them. At 28, she was about to become one of the youngest deputy policy directors in White House history. The fact that she was also one of the few black women to hold the position wasn't lost on her or anyone else. The path to this moment flashed through her mind. Nights spent studying by lamplight in her tiny Harvard dorm room, years of policy work that left her with paper cuts and purpose, the sudden call last week about her predecessor's resignation. Now, standing in the heart of American power, she felt both the crushing weight of expectations and the soaring lift of possibility. Her heels clicked against the floor, a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across portraits of past presidents. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her progress, judging, measuring, wondering if she belonged. The agent stopped at a heavy wooden door. "Your office, Miss Salome. Senior staff meeting begins in 30 minutes. Room 208. Megara nodded, her hand hesitating for just a moment before grasping the brass handle. The door opened silently, revealing a space that still held traces of its previous occupant, a half-empty coffee mug, a forgotten hair tie, a stack of files marked "Urgent" in angry red letters. She set her leather briefcase, another carefully chosen piece, on the desk's smooth surface. The morning light caught the golden nameplate that already bore her credentials. Megara Salome, Deputy Policy Director. Her fingers traced the engraved letters, remembering her mother's voice. "Make them remember your name, baby girl. Make them say it right." A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. A young woman with copper hair and freckles poked her head in, her smile bright but nervous. "Ms. Salome, I'm Kate Matthews, your assistant. I've got your schedule for the day and the briefs for this morning's meeting with the president." Megara's heart skipped at those last words. President Declan Oscar. His reputation preceded him like a storm front. Brilliant but ruthless, a political prodigy who'd become the youngest president in U.S. history. His policy decisions were as cutting as his famous good looks, and his temper was legendary. "Thank you, Kate." Megara accepted the thick folder, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "Could you walk me through the protocols for the senior staff meeting?" Kate's smile wavered slightly. "Of course, though you should know." She glanced over her shoulder before continuing in a lower voice. "The president can be intense during morning briefings, especially with new staff." Megara's spine stiffened. She hadn't fought her way through Harvard and years of policy work to be intimidated now. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm sure I can handle it." Kate's expression suggested otherwise, but she launched into a detailed explanation of meeting procedures. Megara listened while scanning the briefing documents, her mind already formulating strategies and responses. The healthcare initiative she'd been brought in to lead was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for some of the old guard's taste. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Kate led her through the labyrinth of corridors to room 208. The senior staff was already assembling, a sea of dark suits and power ties, their conversations a low murmur of political shorthand and inside jokes. A few heads turned as she entered, their gazes carrying varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Megara chose a seat halfway down the long table, positioning herself where she could observe without appearing either too eager or too reticent. She arranged her materials with practiced precision, each movement calculated to project confidence and competence. The room fell silent at 7:59 a.m. Footsteps approached, measured, purposeful steps that seemed to carry the weight of the entire executive branch. The door opened, and President Declan Oscar entered. The air seemed to crystallize around him. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, arctic blue and sharp as broken glass. They swept the room with military precision, cataloguing faces, detecting weakness. Those eyes found Megara, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I see we have a new face," he said, his voice carrying the refined edges of old money and older power. "Harvard's latest contribution to our humble administration." The words themselves were neutral, but his tone carried a subtle venom that made several staffers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Megara met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "Megara Salome, Mr. President, Deputy Policy Director." "Ah, yes, our new healthcare expert." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose Harvard's standards have dropped considerably since my time there?" The room went absolutely still. Megara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained cool and professional. "I wouldn't know about that, sir. I was too busy graduating summa cum laude and publishing policy papers to compare admission standards." A few staffers coughed to hide their reactions. The president's eyes narrowed fractionally, a predator recognizing unexpected resistance. "Well then, Ms. Salome, perhaps you'd like to begin by explaining the glaring oversights in your predecessor's healthcare proposal, the one currently gathering dust on my desk." It was a trap. She hadn't been given access to her predecessor's work yet. But Megara had spent the weekend memorizing every public statement, every leaked memo, every policy point that had made it to the press. "Of course, Mr. President." She opened her folder with steady hands. "The proposal fails to address 3 critical areas: rural healthcare access, prescription drug pricing reform, and preventative care incentives. Additionally, the funding mechanisms rely too heavily on state cooperation without providing adequate federal oversight." She launched into a detailed analysis, her words precise and backed by data. The room's attention shifted, surprise and reluctant respect replacing the earlier skepticism. The president's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Annoyance? Interest? Challenge? For the next 2 hours, he questioned her relentlessly on every aspect of healthcare policy. Each answer she gave was met with another question. Each point she made was challenged. It was intellectual combat at its highest level, and Megara found herself both exhausted and exhilarated. "That will be all for today," he finally announced, gathering his papers. "Ms. Salome, I expect a complete revision of the healthcare proposal on my desk by tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. He paused, those arctic eyes boring into her. Let's see if Harvard taught you anything useful." With that, he strode from the room, leaving behind a wake of tension and unspoken warnings. The other staffers began to file out, some offering Megara sympathetic glances, others carefully avoiding her gaze. Kate appeared at her elbow, face pale. "I'll clear your schedule for the day." Megara nodded, her mind already racing through the task ahead. The president had just guaranteed she'd spend the next 20 hours working without rest. It was a power play, pure and simple, designed to break her spirit or prove her incompetence. As she gathered her materials, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Poor thing won't last a week. Oscar's going to eat her alive." "Did you see how she stood up to him, though?" Megara straightened her spine, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "They'll try to break you, baby, but you're made of stronger stuff than they know." Back in her office, she hung her suit jacket carefully and rolled up her sleeves. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the room in golden light that felt more like a spotlight than a blessing. On her desk, the stack of files seemed to have multiplied, each one filled with the complexities of American healthcare policy. She opened her laptop, fingers hovering over the keys for just a moment. Then, with the same determination that had carried her from a small apartment in Chicago to the halls of Harvard and now to the White House, she began to write. The president wanted to test her limits. Fine, she would show him exactly what those limits were, and then she would exceed them. Outside her window, Washington continued its eternal dance of power and politics. Inside, Megara Salome prepared for war. Chapter 2. Sharp Edges. Dawn painted the Washington Monument in shades of gold as Megara made her way through the West Wing's quiet corridors, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. After yesterday's confrontational meeting, she'd spent the night in her Georgetown apartment revising the healthcare proposal, fueled by determination and enough coffee to power a small city. The halls still held that peculiar early-morning emptiness that made the White House feel more like a museum than the center of global power. She passed the portrait of FDR, remembering how he, too, had hidden his condition from the public while changing the nation. A noise from the Oval Office interrupted her thoughts, the sound of something falling, followed by muffled cursing. The door was slightly ajar, offering a glimpse of President Oscar picking up a fallen water glass, his hands shaking so badly that water had splashed across his impeccable suit. She watched, frozen, as he pressed his palms flat against the historic resolute desk, breathing deeply, clearly fighting for control. His face, usually masked in aristocratic indifference, showed raw frustration and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Dr. Mitchell appeared suddenly, brushing past her with a well-worn medical bag. "Another episode, Mr. President?" "I'm fine." Declan's voice carried that edge of steel she was beginning to recognize, though it couldn't quite mask the underlying strain. "The medication isn't working as well as it should be." The doctor's tone was grave as he prepared what looked like an injection. 18 months since diagnosis, and the progression is accelerating. We need to consider more aggressive treatment options. "What we need to consider," Declan cut in sharply, though Megara noticed he didn't resist the injection, "is the healthcare proposal on my desk. Leave the meds. I have a meeting." She retreated quickly, her mind racing to process what she'd witnessed. 18 months since diagnosis, progression accelerating. The pieces started forming a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. It explained so much: his legendary temper, the punishing work schedule, the desperate push for healthcare reform. The morning senior staff meeting found her in the Roosevelt Room, watching Declan systematically dismantle another staff member's economic projections. His hands were steady now, whatever medication Dr. Mitchell had administered clearly taking effect. But she noticed things she hadn't before, the slight pallor under his carefully maintained tan, the way he leaned on the podium for support when he thought no one was watching, the tension in his jaw that spoke of hidden pain. "Miss Salome." His voice snapped her out of her observations, those Arctic eyes fixing on her with laser intensity. "Since you seem so fascinated by my presentation style, perhaps you'd like to share your revisions to the healthcare proposal." She stood, refusing to be intimidated. "Certainly, Mr. President." Moving to the podium, she heard him inhale sharply, a tiny sound of pain he couldn't quite suppress. Without missing a beat, she deliberately dropped her papers, buying him time to compose himself while she gathered them. The look he gave her was unreadable, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise at her subtle assistance. For the next hour, they engaged in what felt like intellectual combat at its highest level. Every point she made was challenged, every solution questioned, but she began to notice a pattern. His criticisms, though still cutting, pushed her thinking in new directions. When she defended rural healthcare access, he forced her to consider implementation challenges. When she proposed insurance reforms, he made her examine market implications. "Your funding mechanisms are innovative," he admitted at one point, "but have you considered the impact on smaller hospitals' operating costs?" She had, and launched into a detailed analysis that actually made him lean forward with interest. He wasn't just attacking, he was testing, probing, almost teaching. "Your rural healthcare access plan," he said finally, shuffling papers in a way that didn't quite hide a tremor, "needs more detail on implementation timelines, but—" He paused, and for a moment something like approval flickered in those Arctic eyes. "The framework is solid. The approach to community health centers is particularly thorough." Coming from him, it was practically a standing ovation. As the meeting ended and staff filed out, she lingered, organizing her notes. Through the open door, she heard Dr. Mitchell's voice in the hallway, speaking urgently to the vice president. "The experimental treatments aren't working as hoped. The nerve degeneration is progressing faster than we anticipated. At this rate, he has maybe 2 years before total incapacitation. He's pushing himself too hard, Jack. These 18-hour days, the constant stress." "Try telling him that," Warner responded grimly. "You know how he is when anyone suggests slowing down." The conversation cut off as they rounded a corner, but the implications hit Megara like a physical blow. 2 years. The President of the United States was dying, and almost no one knew. "Did you need something, Miss Salome?" She turned to find Declan watching her, his expression guarded, but with an undercurrent of something else. Resignation, perhaps, or challenge. Up close, she could see the toll whatever illness plagued him was taking, subtle signs hidden beneath his powerful presence. "Yes, sir. About the implementation timelines." She hesitated, then added softly, "Some things can't wait for perfect conditions. Sometimes we have to act with the time we have." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition that she might have overheard, might understand more than she should. For a moment the mask slipped, showing a glimpse of the man beneath the presidency, the human beneath the power. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Then Kate appeared with urgent messages about a developing situation in Eastern Europe, and the moment shattered. But something had changed, subtle but significant. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Every proposal she submitted was met with impossible demands for revision. Every success was acknowledged with faint praise, wrapped in criticism. But underneath their professional battles, something else was developing, an unspoken understanding, a grudging respect. She learned to read the signs of his bad days, the way his right hand would curl into a fist when tremors threatened, how his voice would take on a sharper edge when fighting pain, The slight hesitation before standing, that meant his balance was off. She began to subtly adjust meetings and presentations to accommodate these moments without drawing attention, moving papers closer when his reach was unsteady, creating natural breaks when she saw fatigue setting in, positioning herself to provide subtle support if needed. He, in turn, began to rely on her strategic mind. Their late-night policy sessions became a blend of intellectual sparring and collaborative problem-solving. She noticed he was sharper in the evenings, the day's medications wearing off, leaving him somehow more real, more human, even as his symptoms became harder to hide. One particularly late evening, working in her office, she received an urgent message from Agent Thompson, head of Declan's Secret Service detail. The text was brief but loaded with significance. Medical emergency in the Oval. Dr. Mitchell requests your presence. Discreetly. Her heart pounding, she made her way through the silent corridors. She found Declan sitting in his chair, face grey with pain, as Dr. Mitchell administered an injection. The president's usual immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loose, hair damp with sweat. "Stubborn fool wouldn't let me call anyone else," the doctor muttered, packing away his medical supplies. "Said you'd understand the need for discretion. Said you'd know how to handle any policy questions if he's indisposed." "I do." She moved to Declan's side, instinctively taking his trembling hand. He gripped back with surprising strength, though she could feel the tremors running through him. "The experimental treatment failed," he said through clenched teeth, arctic eyes clouded with pain, but still sharp with intelligence. "We'll need to accelerate the healthcare reforms. Time's running short. Then we'll work faster." She met his gaze steadily. "Some battles can't wait." He studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why aren't you afraid of me like everyone else? Why don't you run when things get difficult?" "Because I see you," she answered simply. "Not just the president, but the man fighting battles no one else knows about. The leader pushing for change while racing against time." She paused, then added softly, "The human being behind the power." Something shifted between them in that moment, a fundamental change in how they saw each other. He wasn't just the tyrannical president, and she wasn't just the defiant new deputy director. They were two people united by purpose, understanding, and a growing connection neither was ready to name. "Stay," he said quietly as Dr. Mitchell left. "Help me finish the healthcare funding analysis, if you're willing." She stayed. They worked through the night, his color gradually improving as the medication took effect. She pretended not to notice how he sometimes had to stop and close his eyes against pain, just as he pretended not to notice how she quietly moved, things within easier reach. As dawn approached, painting the Washington sky in shades of promise, something had fundamentally changed. The walls between them had cracked, letting in light that would eventually transform shadows into something brighter, something neither of them could have anticipated. Outside the White House windows, Washington stirred to life, unaware that in the nation's most powerful office, two hearts were beginning to beat in dangerous synchronicity, and a journey that would change both their lives had truly begun. Megara gathered her papers as the day shift began arriving, watching Declan transform back into the formidable President Oscar. But now she knew what lay beneath the power and the pride, a man racing against time, fighting not just for his legacy, but for real change. "Ms. Salome," he called as she reached the door. When she turned, his face was unreadable, but his eyes held something new. "Thank you," she nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. "Of course, Mr. President. The games would continue, the battles would rage on. But now they had an ally in each other, and in the quiet moments between night and day, something else was growing, something that would eventually challenge every boundary they'd built and every rule they'd sworn to follow. Chapter 3. Breaking Points. The healthcare policy meeting had gone nuclear. Rain lashed against the Roosevelt room windows as President Oscar systematically dismantled Megara's latest proposal, his Arctic eyes flashing with an intensity that made even seasoned staffers flinch. Perhaps, his voice carried that lethal edge she'd come to recognize as masking pain, you could explain how you expect rural hospitals to implement these changes without bankrupting themselves in the first quarter. But something was off. Beyond his usual sharp critique, she noticed the slight tremor in his right hand, the way his left gripped the chair back too tightly, the beads of sweat at his temples despite the room's cool temperature. After weeks of watching him, learning his tells, she knew this was different, worse. The implementation timeline can be adjusted, she countered, deliberately drawing the room's attention to her and away from his increasingly obvious distress. If we phase the requirements over, we don't have time for phases. The outburst was unprecedented, making even the vice president start. Declan caught himself, jaw clenching. This meeting is over. Everyone out, except you, Miss Salome. The room cleared quickly, staff members exchanging worried glances. As the door closed, Declan sagged slightly, his mask slipping. Sir? She moved closer, concern overriding protocol. Should I call Dr. Mitchell? No. His voice was strained but commanding. The medication, in my desk, top right drawer. She retrieved the pills, recognizing the prescription, a new experimental treatment she'd researched after overhearing Dr. Mitchell's conversations. Her hand shook slightly as she measured out the dose. How long have the symptoms been this severe? His laugh was harsh. Playing detective, Miss Salome, those keen powers of observation, noting every tremor, every moment of weakness. Someone has to. She met his gaze steadily. Since you seem determined to work yourself to death? Not determination. He accepted the pills, his fingers brushing hers. Necessity. Time isn't a luxury I have anymore. The admission hung between them, the first time he'd openly acknowledged his condition to her. Thunder rolled outside, matching the gravity of the moment. How long? She asked softly. Since diagnosis? 18 months. He moved to his familiar window position, though she suspected it was more for support than contemplation now. Hartman's disease. Progressive neurodegeneration. The experimental treatments were showing promise, but he gestured vaguely with his trembling hand. But they're failing. Everything's failing. The words carried such raw honesty that she felt them like physical blows. The treatments, the healthcare reforms, my ability to hide this. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face in harsh relief. In that moment, she saw past the presidency, past the power and position, to the man beneath. Brilliant, driven, and terrified in a way he'd never admit. Then stop hiding, she said quietly. At least with me. He turned to face her, those Arctic eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Why? Why offer that? Because you need someone to trust. Someone who understands what these healthcare reforms really mean, why they can't wait. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Your mother died waiting for treatment she couldn't afford. The old pain surfaced, but she pushed through it. That's why I specialized in healthcare policy, why I fought so hard to get here, why I won't let you sabotage these reforms by working yourself to death before they're implemented. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then suddenly he stumbled. She moved without thinking, catching him before he could fall. His weight nearly took them both down, but she managed to help him to his chair. I should call... Wait. His hand caught hers, surprisingly strong despite the tremors. Just wait. So she waited, standing beside his chair as the storm raged outside. Gradually his breathing steadied, some color returning to his face. The doctors initially gave me 2 to 3 years, he said quietly. At this rate of progression, Maybe 1 year of functional capacity left. Barely enough time to push through meaningful reform. Then let me help. She knelt beside his chair, still holding his hand. Stop fighting me on every point, and let me help you make this work. We're running out of time for power plays and political games. He studied their joined hands, his thumb absently tracing patterns on her skin. You tie your career to a dying man's crusade. I'd fight beside someone who understands what's at stake, someone willing to spend his last months trying to fix a broken system. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the windows. In that illuminated moment, something shifted between them, a fundamental change in how they saw each other. "Help me up," he said finally. "If we're going to rewrite this proposal, I'd rather do it from my desk." She supported him as he stood, pretending not to notice how heavily he leaned on her. Once seated at his desk, some of his usual authority returned, though softened by their shared understanding. They worked through the night, the storm gradually moving away as they rebuilt the healthcare proposal from the ground up. She noticed how he winced when reaching for certain papers, so she began anticipating which documents he'd need, placing them within easy reach. He, in turn, started actually listening to her ideas instead of automatically challenging them. Dawn was breaking when they finally finished, the first hints of pink and gold touching the Washington Monument visible through his window. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a washed-clean world full of possibility. "Thank you," he said quietly as she gathered her things. "Not just for—" He gestured vaguely at where she'd helped him earlier. "For understanding the urgency, for being willing to help." "That's my job, Mr. President." "Declan." The word was soft but clear. "After tonight, I think you've earned the right to use my name, in private at least." She met his gaze, seeing something there she'd never noticed before, a warmth beneath the ice, like sunlight under frozen water. "Megara," she offered in return. He nodded, and something shifted between them, subtle but significant. The barriers of rank and protocol didn't disappear entirely, but they became more permeable, allowing glimpses of the people behind the positions. As she walked back to her office through the awakening White House, Megara felt the weight of what had happened settling around her shoulders. She now carried not just policy responsibilities, but a secret that could shake the foundations of American government. Yet strangely, she felt stronger rather than burdened. Something had broken between them last night, but something else had been forged in its place, something that felt like trust, or maybe the beginning of friendship, or maybe, whispered a voice she wasn't ready to acknowledge, something more. The morning sun streamed through the windows, turning the marble halls to gold. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the first stirrings of the day shift arriving. Soon, the White House would resume its normal rhythms of power and politics. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, Megara allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had changed. The world looked different somehow, as if the storm had washed away more than just dust and debris. She touched the place on her wrist, where his hand had gripped it, remembering the desperation in that touch, the vulnerability in those Arctic eyes, the way he'd said her name. Changes were coming. She could feel it. Like the air after a storm, everything felt charged with possibility. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she didn't dare examine too closely, something else was changing too. Something that felt dangerous and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The game had changed, the rules rewritten, and Megara Salome, who had always played by the book, suddenly found herself in uncharted territory. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, she had work to do. Chapter 4. Fault Lines. A week after the storm, the White House hummed with its usual energy, but for Megara, everything had changed. The weight of Declan's secret colored every interaction, every meeting, every shared glance across the conference table. His illness remained hidden and from public view, but she could see it now, in the slight tremor of his hands during long meetings, in the way he sometimes gripped his desk when standing, in the shadows that flickered behind his Arctic eyes. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Roosevelt Room as senior staff gathered for the daily briefing. Megara sat in her usual spot, watching Declan command the room with his characteristic authority. If others noticed anything different about him, they didn't show it. "The healthcare initiative," he was saying, his voice strong and steady, "needs to be our primary focus for the next quarter. Ms. Salome, walk us through the changes." She stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. The dynamics had shifted subtly since their late-night collaboration. Where once there had been open hostility, now there was something else, a kind of measured respect that made others take notice. "Thank you, Mr. President." She launched into her presentation, the words flowing naturally after countless hours of preparation. As she spoke, she noticed how he listened, really listened, his blue eyes focused intently on her words, rather than searching for weaknesses to exploit. The meeting proceeded smoothly, until Marcus Chen, the communications director, raised an objection about the rural healthcare timeline. "With all due respect," he said, his tone suggesting anything but, "this implementation schedule is incredibly aggressive. We're talking about restructuring the entire rural healthcare system in 18 months. It's not realistic." Before Megara could respond, Declan cut in. "The timeline stays as is." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, but she caught the slight tension in his jaw, pain carefully masked. "Mr. President," Marcus persisted, "the political fallout is less important than getting this right." Declan stood, using the movement to disguise a moment of unsteadiness that only Megara seemed to notice. "Ms. Salome has done extensive research on implementation feasibility. I suggest you review her data before raising further objections." The room fell silent, surprised by his decisive support of her position. Megara kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced at this public display of trust. After the meeting, she lingered, organizing her papers until the room cleared. Only then did she approach his chair. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Support solid policy." He remained seated, and she pretended not to notice how his knuckles whitened on the armrest. "Your research is sound, your timeline aggressive but achievable. It deserved to be defended." Still, she perched on the edge of the conference table, close enough to speak privately but maintaining professional distance. "Thank you." He looked up at her then, those blue eyes softening slightly. "How are you handling it?" "Handling what?" "Knowing." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. "Being one of 3 people who know the leader of the free world is—" He trailed off, unwilling or unable to finish the sentence. Megara considered her answer carefully. "It's challenging. Watching you push yourself so hard, knowing what it costs you, seeing others misinterpret your reactions when you're in pain." "Is that concern I hear, Ms. Salome?" His tone was light, but something flickered in his eyes, vulnerability quickly masked. "Professional concern for the success of our healthcare initiative, Mr. President." She matched his tone, playing along with the pretense. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Of course, purely professional." The moment stretched between them, charged with things unsaid. Then Kate appeared in the doorway, and reality rushed back in. "Ms. Salome, Senator Morrison's office is on the line about the funding proposal." "Thank you, Kate." Megara straightened, resuming her professional demeanor. "Mr. President." He nodded, dismissing her with the same authority he always had. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Dinner in my office tonight, 8 o'clock. We need to discuss the state-level implementation details." It wasn't really a request, but then again, presidents rarely made requests. She nodded and left, feeling his gaze follow her out. The day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but beneath the surface of every interaction ran an undercurrent of anticipation. 8 o'clock approached with the inevitability of tide. At precisely 8, Megara knocked on the Oval Office door, a stack of implementation reports under her arm. The Secret Service agent nodded her through without comment. Her clearance had been upgraded after that night, though no official explanation was given. Declan sat not at his desk, but on one of the sofas, his tie loosened, jacket draped over a chair. A small table had been set up with covered plates and what looked like sparkling water in wine glasses. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the other sofa. "I hope you like Italian." She set her reports aside and sat, taking in the unusual setting. "I wasn't expecting actual dinner when you said dinner meeting. Even presidents have to eat." He removed the covers, revealing perfectly prepared pasta dishes. "And discussions like this go better with food." As they ate, they talked policy, state funding mechanisms, implementation timelines, political strategies. But gradually, the conversation shifted, becoming more personal. "You never asked about the diagnosis," he said during a lull. "Most people would have researched every detail by now." "Would you have wanted me to?" He considered this, twirling pasta around his fork with practiced elegance. But most people would have anyway." "I'm not most people." She met his gaze steadily. "And I figured you'd tell me what I needed to know when you were ready." Something changed in his expression then, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his perpetual guard. "It's called Hartman's disease," he said quietly. "Progressive neurodegeneration affecting motor control and cognitive function. Eventually ... He trailed off, but she could fill in the blanks. How long? 2 years, maybe 3 with aggressive treatment. His voice was clinical, detached, as if discussing someone else's prognosis. Long enough to see this healthcare initiative through, if we work quickly. Is that why you've been pushing so hard? Racing against time? He set down his fork, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Partly, but also because it matters. Because people like your mother and my sister shouldn't die due to inadequate health care. The mention of her mother startled her. "How did you—" "I read your file after that night. Wanted to understand what drives you." He paused, then added softly, "I'm sorry about your mother. I'm sorry about your sister." She hesitated, then asked, "What was her name?" "Sarah." The word seemed to cost him something. "She was brilliant. Harvard Medical School, top of her class. But then she got sick, and our family's money and connections meant nothing because the system itself was broken. She died waiting for treatment that was technically available but practically inaccessible. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with shared pain and understanding. Without thinking, Megara reached across the space between them, placing her hand over his. He stiffened at the contact but didn't pull away. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she could feel the slight tremor that he worked so hard to hide. "That's why this matters," she said softly. "Not just the policy or the politics, but the people, the families who won't have to go through what we did." He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining briefly before professional instinct made them both pull back. "We should review the state funding proposals," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Of course, Mr. President." But as they returned to work, something had shifted again. The professional facades they maintained had cracked just enough to reveal the humans beneath, Two people shaped by loss, driven by purpose, and increasingly aware of each other as more than just colleagues. The night deepened around them as they worked, the Washington Monument visible through the windows like a pale ghost in the darkness. They moved from the sofas to his desk, spreading papers across its historic surface as they fine-tuned their strategy. Around midnight, Megara noticed him rubbing his temples, a sure sign of oncoming pain. "We should stop for tonight," she said gently. "There's more to do. There's always more to do, but you need rest." He looked up at her, those blue eyes clouded with fatigue and something else, something that made her heart beat faster. "You don't have to protect me, Megara." The use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine. "Someone has to, since you won't protect yourself." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Is that what you're doing, protecting me?" "I'm protecting the initiative," she said, but they both knew it wasn't entirely true. He stood, moving around the desk until he was standing in front of her. In the soft lamplight, his face looked different, younger, more vulnerable. "You're remarkable, you know that." His voice was soft, almost wondering. "I've thrown everything I could at you, and you've not only survived, but thrived. You've turned my worst criticisms into improvements, my obstacles into opportunities. I had a good teacher," she said, trying to lighten the suddenly heavy atmosphere, even if his teaching methods were somewhat brutal. He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and genuine. The sound transformed his face, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been without the weight of the presidency and terminal illness. "Go home," he said finally. "Get some rest. We have a big day tomorrow." She gathered her things, hyper-aware of his presence as he walked her to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Declan?" The name felt foreign on her tongue, but right somehow. "Thank you for trusting me, with all of it." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, very softly, he said, "Thank you for being trustworthy." The words followed her through the empty corridors of the White House, echoing in her mind as she drove home through the quiet Washington streets. Something was happening between them, something that transcended professional collaboration or even friendship. It should have frightened her. It should have sent her running in the opposite direction. Instead, she found herself thinking about the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the way his eyes softened when he laughed, the trust he'd placed in her. Change was coming, as inevitable as the sunrise that would soon paint the city in shades of gold. But for now, in the quiet hours between night and morning, Megara allowed herself to feel the full weight of this shifting reality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new moments of connection and conflict. But tonight, she would remember the way he'd said her name, the shared pain that bound them together, and the possibility that hung in the air between them like an unspoken promise. The city slept on, unaware that in the White House, fault lines were shifting, boundaries blurring, and two hearts were beginning to beat in dangerous synchronicity. Chapter 5. Stormfront. The call came at 3 a.m., a sharp, insistent ring that cut through Megara's dreams like a knife. She fumbled for her secure phone, heart racing as she recognized the White House emergency line. Ms. Salome. The voice belonged to Agent Thompson, head of Declan's Secret Service detail. "The President needs you at the White House, now." She was already moving, muscle memory guiding her through the dark apartment as she grabbed clothes. "Is he?" "He's in the Oval. Code word is Stormbreak." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, she cleared security and hurried through the darkened corridors of the West Wing. The usual bustle of the White House was reduced to a skeleton crew, agents at their posts, a few bleary-eyed staffers monitoring global situations. She found him standing at the window behind his desk, silhouetted against the city lights. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind his back with military precision. "Mr. President?" He turned, and she caught her breath. His face was drawn with pain and exhaustion. but his eyes burned with an intensity that made her shiver. "St. Joseph's Hospital in Kansas City just declared bankruptcy," he said without preamble. "They're shutting down their emergency services at dawn. 300,000 people will lose their primary emergency care provider." Understanding dawned. This was exactly the kind of healthcare crisis their initiative was designed to prevent. "How many other rural hospitals are at risk?" 17. He moved to his desk, revealing spread papers and multiple laptops displaying data, all in critical service areas, all on the brink of collapse. She stepped closer, scanning the numbers. The situation was worse than they'd anticipated, much worse. "We need to move up the timeline," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "We can't wait for the full legislative process. You're talking about executive action. I'm talking about saving lives." He turned to face her fully, and she saw the cost of this night written in the lines around his eyes. "My sister died waiting for Congress to act. I won't let that happen to anyone else." The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. This wasn't just about healthcare policy anymore. This was personal for both of them. "Executive action will face legal challenges," she said carefully. "The opposition will claim overreach. Let them." His voice carried the edge of steel she remembered from their early confrontations. "I'd rather fight in court than watch more hospitals close." She studied him, noting the slight tremor in his right hand that he tried to hide by gripping the desk. The medication wasn't working as well as it had been. "When was your last dose?" His jaw tightened. "That's not relevant to—" "It's relevant if you're about to make decisions that will affect millions of lives." She met his gaze steadily. "When?" For a moment she thought he would pull rank, remind her of their respective positions. Instead, his shoulders sagged slightly. "Yesterday afternoon, I was distracted by the initial reports." Without a word, she crossed to the cabinet where she knew he kept his medication. The familiar bottle was there, along with a bottle of water. "Megara." His voice stopped her as she measured out the pills. "I can't afford to be foggy right now. The medication takes 30 minutes to reach full effect," she finished, "which gives us exactly enough time to review the hospital data properly before making any decisions." He accepted the pills with a ghost of a smile. Manipulative. Practical. She returned to the desk, spreading out the reports. "Now show me the numbers for the other 17 hospitals." They worked in focused silence for the next hour, breaking down financial data, patient statistics, and healthcare coverage gaps. As the medication took effect, she watched some of the tension ease from his shoulders, though the intensity in his eyes never wavered. "Look at this pattern," she said finally, pointing to a series of figures. "The hospitals aren't failing because of market forces. They're being systematically undercut by insurance company policies." Declan leaned in to study the data, bringing him close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her pulse quicken. "Coordinated action," he murmured. "They're forcing closures to consolidate emergency services in urban centers, where they can charge higher rates." She turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "This isn't just a healthcare crisis, it's market manipulation." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. In that moment, they weren't president and advisor. They were partners, united in purpose and understanding. "Draft the executive order," he said softly. "Make it bulletproof." She nodded, already mentally composing the legal framework. But as she turned to move away, his hand caught her wrist, gentle but insistent. "Megara!" His voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you for coming when I called, for understanding why this matters." The touch of his fingers on her skin sent sparks of awareness through her body. "You don't have to thank me for doing my job. Is that what this is? Just your job?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. She looked up into those Arctic blue eyes and saw something that made her breath catch, vulnerability, need, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "You know it's not," she whispered. His thumb traced small circles on her wrist, each touch sending shivers up her arm. For a moment she thought he might pull her closer. Instead, he released her slowly, reluctantly. "We should get to work on that executive order." The spell broke, reality rushing back in. They were still in the Oval Office. He was still the president. She was still his advisor. The lines between them might be blurring, but they couldn't forget who they were, or what was at stake. Dawn found them still working, the executive order taking shape under their combined efforts. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware of the battle being waged in the quiet hours of morning. Kate arrived at 6, bringing coffee and concerned glances. Other staff began filtering in, drawn by the news of the hospital closure and rumors of executive action. "Coordinate with communications," Declan instructed as the room filled. "I want to get ahead of this story, frame it as what it is, a fight for American lives." Megara watched him shift seamlessly into his public role, the commanding presence, the decisive leader. Only she saw how he gripped his pen too tightly, how he used the desk for support when standing. The morning devolved into a blur of meetings and phone calls. Senators demanded explanations. Insurance company lobbyists made thinly veiled threats. Conservative pundits were already crying government overreach. Through it all, Declan remained unshakable, his Arctic eyes flashing with controlled fury as he defended their actions. But in quiet moments, when others weren't watching, she caught glimpses of the toll it was taking. Late afternoon found them back in the Oval Office, reviewing the final draft of the executive order. The room was quieter now, most of the staff dismissed to handle various aspects of the brewing storm. "You should rest," she said softly, watching him rub his temples. "The announcement isn't until tomorrow. Too much to do." But his voice was strained, the words slightly slurred, a warning sign she'd learned to recognize. "Declan." She moved to stand beside his chair. "You can't help anyone if you collapse again." He looked up at her, and the naked emotion in his eyes made her heart clench. "I can't stop. Not when we're so close. Not when people's lives depend on this." "Then let me help." She placed her hand over his, where it rested on the desk. "That's why I'm here." The moment stretched between them, charged with everything they couldn't say. Then slowly, he turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. "You've become dangerous," he murmured. "How so?" "You make me want to lean on someone. I can't afford that weakness." "It's not weakness to need people, Declan." He stood then, still holding her hand, bringing them face to face. In the fading afternoon light, his eyes seemed to hold all the shadows of their shared battles. "No," he said softly. "The weakness is in wanting more than I can have." Before she could respond, a knock at the door forced them apart. Marcus Chen entered with polling data, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the tension in the room. The rest of the evening passed in a whirlwind of preparation. By the time Megara left the White House, stars were visible above the city's glow. But as she drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Declan's hand had felt in hers, the look in his eyes when he'd talked about weakness. Something was shifting between them, as unstoppable as the tide. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the executive order, the public reaction, the battles ahead. But tonight, in the quiet of her car, Megara finally admitted the truth she'd been trying to deny. She was falling in love with the President of the United States, and judging by the way he'd looked at her, she wasn't falling alone. The city lights blurred as she drove, each one a reminder of the lives they were fighting to protect, each one a star in the constellation of their shared purpose. The storm was coming, But maybe, just maybe, they would weather it together. Chapter 6. Hearts in Shadow. The executive order unleashed a firestorm. For 3 days, the White House had been under siege, metaphorically from the press and literally from protesters who lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Inside the West Wing, Megara hadn't left her office for more than a few hours at a time, coordinating responses to legal challenges and managing the implementation of emergency healthcare measures. It was nearing midnight when Kate appeared in her doorway, face drawn with exhaustion. "The president wants to see you in the Oval. He says it's urgent." Megara's heart jumped, though she kept her expression neutral. Since that moment in his office, since he'd held her hand and spoken of weakness, they'd maintained careful professional distance. The crisis demanded their full attention, but beneath every interaction ran an undercurrent of unresolved tension. She found him standing at the window, his familiar position when troubled. The television played silently in the background, showing footage of protesters outside failing hospitals. "Mr. President." He turned and she caught her breath. In the soft lamplight, he looked somehow both powerful and vulnerable, the weight of his office evident in the set of his shoulders, the cost of his illness visible in the shadows under his eyes. "The Supreme Court is going to hear the challenge to our executive order," he said without preamble. "Emergency session. They're fast-tracking it." The news hit her like a physical blow. "How long?" 3 days. He moved to his desk, revealing spread papers and legal briefs. "We need to prepare our defense. Everything has to be perfect." She approached the desk, scanning the documents. "The conservative justices will focus on executive overreach. We need to frame this as an emergency response within established presidential powers. Like Lincoln during the Civil War." "Exactly." She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "We can cite precedent from—" "You're remarkable." The words came suddenly, cutting through her professional focus. "I'm just doing my job." "No." He moved around the desk until he stood before her. "You're fighting. For people you've never met, for a cause that matters, for—" He paused, something flickering in those Arctic eyes. "For me." The air between them seemed to crystallize, charged with 3 days of careful distance and months of growing connection. "Someone has to," she said softly, echoing words from days ago. His hand rose, hesitating for a moment before touching her cheek. His fingers were warm against her skin, slightly trembling, from emotion or illness. She couldn't tell. "Do you know what you've done to me?" His voice was rough with feeling. "You've made me care again, made me want things I can't have, shouldn't have. Why can't you have them?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. His thumb traced her cheekbone, sending shivers down her spine. "Because I'm dying," he said bluntly. "Because I'm the president. Because you deserve better than either of those complications." "Shouldn't that be my choice?" He studied her face, those blue eyes searching for something. "You'd choose this? The scandal, the politics, the inevitable end?" "I'd choose you." The words came without conscious thought, straight from her heart to her lips. "I already have." For a moment, he remained perfectly still. Then, with a sound somewhere between a groan and a sigh, he pulled her close and kissed her. The world seemed to stop. His lips were soft but demanding, tasting of coffee and decisions and desire too long denied. Her hands found his chest, feeling his heart race beneath expensive wool and starched cotton. His fingers tangled in her hair, cradling her head as though she were something precious and fragile. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against hers. "This is insane. Completely." She smiled, her hand still gripping his suit jacket. "Want to stop?" God, no. He kissed her again, deeper this time, backing her against his desk, papers scattered, but neither of them cared. The kiss might have lasted seconds or hours. Time seemed to lose meaning in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally separated, reality began to seep back in around the edges. "The Supreme Court," she murmured against his neck. His fingers traced patterns on her back. "Rather not think about 9 justices right now." She laughed softly, the sound muffled against his shirt. "We need to prepare the defense." "We will." He pulled back slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But first." His phone rang, shattering the moment. The ringtone was distinctive, the vice president's private line. They separated quickly, years of professional training taking over. Declan answered the phone while Megara straightened her clothes and retrieved scattered papers from the floor. "Yes, Jack." "No, I've seen the polling." "Yes, we're preparing for the Supreme Court." As he spoke, she watched tension creep back into his shoulders. Whatever the vice president was saying, it wasn't good news. When the call ended, Declan sat heavily in his chair. "The opposition is planning to use the hospital crisis to push for impeachment. They're claiming I deliberately created the emergency to justify executive overreach." Megara's blood ran cold. "They can't prove that. They don't need to prove it. They just need to create enough doubt to undermine our position before the Supreme Court." He rubbed his temples, a warning sign she'd learned to recognize. Without a word, she retrieved his medication and a bottle of water. This time, he took the pills without argument. "We should keep our distance," he said after swallowing them. "At least until after the Supreme Court hearing. We can't risk—" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I won't let them take this too." He looked up at her, surprise and something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Megara—" "We'll be discreet," she said, moving to stand beside his chair. "Professional in public, careful in private. But I won't pretend this isn't happening. I won't act like I don't—" She paused, gathering courage. "Like I don't love you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. For a moment he just stared at her, those Arctic eyes wide with emotion. Then he stood, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that took her breath away. "Say it again." "I love you." She touched his face, feeling the slight tremor under his skin. "All of you. The president, the man, even the stubborn patient who fights taking his medication." He laughed, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you too. God help me, but I do." They kissed again, softer this time, sealing the declaration with tender certainty. When they separated, reality was waiting, but it seemed less daunting somehow. "We should get to work on the Supreme Court defense," she said, though she made no move to leave his embrace. "We should," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But first, I need you to know something." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "What?" "Whatever happens, with the court, with my health, with us, these moments are worth it. You're worth it." The words wrapped around her heart like a promise. Outside, protesters still chanted and cameras still flashed. Inside, 2 people who had found each other against all odds held on tight, creating a shelter in the heart of the storm. They worked through the night, preparing their legal defense between stolen kisses and shared looks that held volumes of meaning. As dawn approached, Megara watched Declan deliver instructions to early arriving staff, marveling at how he could switch so seamlessly between private tenderness and public authority. The game had changed again, the stakes higher than ever. But as she sat in the morning briefing, feeling the phantom touch of his lips on hers, Megara knew they would face whatever came together. Let the storm rage. They had found their shelter in each other's hearts. The sun rose over Washington, painting the White House in shades of gold and promise. A new day was beginning, bringing with it challenges and battles and moments of joy stolen from the shadows. But for now, in the quiet of early morning, two hearts beat in perfect synchronicity, their owners bound together by love, purpose, and the courage to reach for happiness in the midst of chaos. The world would try to tear them apart. Politics, illness, duty, and circumstance would conspire against them. But in that moment, watching the sunrise paint Declan's face in gentle light, Megara knew some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth any price. Chapter 7. Hidden Currents. The Supreme Court's decision came down like a thunderbolt, a narrow 5-4 victory upholding the executive order. Megara stood in the back of the Oval Office, watching Declan address the nation with the quiet authority that had first drawn her to him. His hands, she noticed, gripped the podium more tightly than usual, but only she and perhaps the Vice President would recognize the tell. "This ruling affirms what we've always known," he was saying, his voice strong and steady despite the tremors she knew he was fighting. "Healthcare is not a privilege for the wealthy few, but a fundamental right for all Americans. Today, we begin the work of ensuring that right." The cameras flashed, recording his triumph for posterity. None of them caught how he stumbled slightly when stepping away from the podium, or how smoothly Megara moved to steady him, making it look like nothing more than a casual adjustment of his papers. "Clear the room," she ordered once the cameras stopped rolling, her tone brooking no argument. The staff filed out, leaving them alone in the familiar confines of the Oval Office. "I'm fine," he said before she could speak, but his pale face betrayed him. "You're not." She locked the door and moved to the cabinet where she kept his backup medication. "You pushed too hard during the hearings." "We won." But he didn't resist when she guided him to sit on one of the sofas. "At what cost?" She measured out his pills with practiced care. "Dr. Mitchell says the stress is accelerating the progression." His hand covered hers as she offered the medication. "Worth it." "Not to me." The words came out sharper than intended, weighted with 3 weeks of watching him push himself to the brink. "Not if it means losing you sooner." Something softened in his eyes. He took the pills, then pulled her down beside him. "Come here." She went willingly into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with something distinctly him. His arms were strong around her, though she could feel the slight tremor that never quite went away anymore. "I had an idea," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "It's probably insane." "Most of your ideas are." She smiled against his chest. "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have changed his mind. Then, very softly, he said, "What would you think about having a child?" Megara went perfectly still. "What?" "I know it's crazy." His arms tightened slightly around her. "I know the timing is impossible, and the political fallout would be nuclear, and I won't be—" He swallowed hard. "I won't be here to help raise them. But I've been thinking about legacy lately, about leaving something behind besides policy changes and executive orders." She sat up to look at him, her heart pounding. "You're serious about this? Completely?" Those Arctic eyes held hers with characteristic intensity. "Doctor, Mitchell says we'd need to start fertility treatment soon, while it's still possible. But only if you want this. Only if you're ready for what it would mean." The magnitude of what he was suggesting washed over her. A child, their child. A piece of him that would live on after. She couldn't finish the thought. "The media would crucify us," she said, thinking out loud. "The opposition would use it to destroy everything we've built." "I know." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "But maybe that's not the only thing that matters. Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them spring apart with well-practiced speed. Megara moved to the desk, adopting a professional pose, as Declan called out, "Enter!" Marcus Chen burst in, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "Mr. President, we have a situation. Senator Morrison is giving a press conference. He's claiming to have evidence that you knew about the hospital closures months in advance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Declan's face hardened into the mask of authority she'd first known him by. "What kind of evidence?" "Emails, supposedly, between your office and the insurance companies." Marcus glanced nervously at Megara. He's also hinting at other revelations. The implication was clear. Someone suspected their relationship. "Get me everything we have on Morrison's connections to the insurance lobby," Declan ordered, his voice carrying the edge of steel she remembered from their early confrontations, "and find out who's feeding him information." Marcus nodded and hurried out, leaving them in charged silence. "This changes things," Declan said quietly once they were alone again. "Does it?" She moved back to his side, determination replacing uncertainty. "Or does it just make the timing better?" He looked at her questioningly. "Think about it," she continued, the plan forming as she spoke. "They're going to come after us anyway. Why not give them something real to talk about? Something that shows you as human rather than calculating." "A baby." His voice held a mixture of hope and hesitation. "You're serious about this?" "I love you." She took his hand, feeling the tremors that spoke of his limited time. "And I want everything with you, even if we have to fight for it, even if we only get a short time together." He pulled her close, kissing her with a desperation that took her breath away. When they separated, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," she teased, trying to lighten the moment. "But you're stuck with me anyway." Their laughter was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Kate, looking apologetic. "Ms. Salome, the Vice President is asking for you. Something about polling data in the swing states." "I'll be right there." She gathered her papers, exchanging a loaded look with Declan. They'd gotten good at these silent conversations, speaking volumes with just their eyes. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of damage control and crisis management. Morrison's allegations dominated the news cycle, but preliminary investigation suggested his evidence was circumstantial at best. It was well past midnight when Megara finally made it back to the Oval Office. Declan was on the phone with his legal team, his voice carrying that slight rasp that meant he was fighting pain. She waited until he hung up before speaking. "I made an appointment with Dr. Mitchell for tomorrow morning." He looked up sharply. "For fertility consultation." She moved to perch on the edge of his desk. "If we're doing this, we need to start soon." His hand found hers, thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "You're sure about this? About all of it?" "I'm sure about you." She leaned down to kiss him softly. "The rest we'll figure out together." The next morning dawned clear and cold, Washington's monuments gleaming like alabaster in the winter sun. Megara sat in Dr. Mitchell's office, holding Declan's hand as they discussed options and timelines. "Given the progression of the president's condition," the doctor was saying, "I recommend we start treatments immediately. The process can take several cycles to succeed, and time is—" He paused diplomatically. "A limited resource," Declan finished, his grip tightening on Megara's hand. "What are our chances?" "With aggressive treatment." "Reasonable, but there are no guarantees." They left the medical office an hour later with a treatment plan and a precious bubble of hope. Walking through the White House corridors, they maintained professional distance, but their shared secret felt like a thread of light connecting them. That evening, as crisis meetings and policy debates finally wound down, they found themselves alone in the Oval Office once again. The Washington Monument was visible through the window, its illuminated form a steady presence in the gathering dusk. "I've been thinking about names," Declan said softly, standing behind her as they looked out at the city. "If it's a girl, maybe Aurora, after the dawn. If it's a boy—" "Let's get pregnant first," she laughed, leaning back against him. "Then we can argue about names." His arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Thank you for giving me this hope, for giving us a future, even if I won't be here to see all of it." She turned in his embrace, touching his face gently. "You'll be here in the ways that matter, in our child's smile, in their determination, in the world we're building for them." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Outside, the city hummed with political intrigue and looming battles. Inside, two hearts beat in sync, dreaming of possibilities and planning for a future that would exist with or without them. The game had changed again, the stakes higher than ever. But as they stood together in the gathering darkness, they were ready for whatever came next. Let Morrison make his accusations, let the media speculate and the opposition plot. They had found something worth fighting for, not just in their policies or their principles, but in the promise of new life and lasting legacy. The night deepened around them, but neither moved to turn on the lights. In the shadows of the most powerful office in the world, they held on to each other and their shared dream of tomorrow. Some battles were worth any cost, some loves were worth any sacrifice, and some futures were worth fighting for, no matter what the odds. Chapter 8. Eye of the Hurricane. The fertility clinic's waiting room was deliberately nondescript, its beige walls and generic artwork designed to fade into the background. Megara sat alone, her heart pounding as she waited for results that would change everything. Declan was tied up in an emergency NATO briefing, the crisis in Eastern Europe, demanding the president's full attention even on this most personal of mornings. Dr. Sandra Chen, their fertility specialist, entered with a manila folder and an unreadable expression. "Miss Salome?" Megara followed her into the consultation room, barely breathing. 6 weeks of hormone treatments, secret appointments, and carefully orchestrated scheduling had led to this moment. "Well," Dr. Chen began, opening the folder, "I have rather extraordinary news." She paused, looking up with a mix of professional concern and barely contained excitement. "You're pregnant, with triplets." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Triplets?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes, all 3 embryos implanted successfully. I must say this is extremely rare, especially for a first IVF attempt." Dr. Chen turned her monitor to show 3 distinct heartbeats flickering on the ultrasound image. "All 3 fetuses appear healthy and well-positioned." Megara stared at the screen, her vision blurring with tears. 3 tiny lives, already defying the odds, just like their father. "The president," she started, then caught herself. "Their father, his condition won't affect the baby's health," Dr. Chen assured her. "Hartmann's disease isn't hereditary." However, her expression grew more serious. "A triplet pregnancy is automatically high risk. You'll need to scale back your work hours significantly." Work, the White House. Reality came crashing back in waves. "When can I tell him?" "Everything looks stable. Whenever you're ready." Dr. Chen smiled warmly. Though, given the unique circumstances, sooner might be better than later. Megara left the clinic in a daze, her Secret Service detail closing ranks around her as she slipped into the waiting car. 3 babies. They had wanted 1 miracle and gotten 3. Her phone buzzed, a message from Kate. Emergency meeting in the Oval. Morrison making new allegations. The timing couldn't have been worse. She arrived at the White House to find it in chaos. Staff members hurried through corridors with worried expressions, phones pressed to their ears. Marcus Chen intercepted her before she could reach the Oval Office. "Thank God you're here," he said, his face ashen. "It's bad, Megara. Really bad." "What's happening?" "Someone leaked your old journal to the press. The one from your first months here." The blood drained from her face. The journal. She'd forgotten about those early entries, written in moments of fury and frustration, when Declan's cutting remarks had left her raw and bleeding. How much did they release? Everything. Marcus handed her a tablet. "It's already trending." Her eyes scanned the headlines with growing horror. Revealed, White House insiders' scathing assessment of President. Cruel, tyrannical, heartless. Senior advisor's private thoughts on President Oscar. White House in crisis as personal journal reveals internal strife. The entries themselves were even worse. Every angry thought, every moment of pain and resentment laid bare for the world to see. Another day of His Imperial Majesty's reign of terror. Does he enjoy watching people crumble under his criticism, or is he just incapable of basic human decency? Sometimes I wonder if he has any heart at all behind those Arctic eyes. The way he dismissed the rural healthcare concerns today was almost sociopathic. I hate him. I hate his smug superiority, his cutting remarks, his complete disregard for anyone he deems beneath him, which is apparently everyone. Words written months ago, before she knew him, before she understood the man behind the mask, before she fell in love with both his strength and his vulnerability. "He's waiting for you," Marcus said quietly. "He's read them all." Megara walked to the Oval Office on legs that felt like lead. How could she tell him about the babies now, when her own words threatened to destroy everything they'd built? She found him standing at his usual window, his back military straight. The set of his shoulders told her everything about his emotional state. "Mr. President," she said softly, closing the door behind her, "did you mean it?" His voice was perfectly controlled, revealing nothing. "What you wrote about me being heartless, sociopathic. I wrote those words before I knew you." She moved closer, aching to touch him but knowing she couldn't. Not yet. "Before I understood why you push so hard, why you demand so much." He turned then, and the pain in his eyes nearly brought her to her knees. "You said you hated me." "I did, then—" She took another step forward. "Just like you hated showing any weakness, just like you hated anyone who challenged your authority." Another step. "We're not those people anymore." His jaw clenched. "The public won't see it that way. They'll say I corrupted you, use my position to—" "I don't care." She closed the final distance between them, taking his face in her hands. "Let them talk. I have something to tell you that's more important than any leaked journal." Something in her tone made him focus fully on her face. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." She watched his eyes widen. "With triplets." He staggered slightly and she guided him to sit on the edge of his desk. "Triplets?" The word came out choked. All three embryos took, all healthy." She placed his trembling hand on her still flat stomach. "We're having 3 babies, Declan." The transformation of his face was extraordinary. Joy broke through the pain like sunlight through storm clouds. He pulled her close, burying his face in her neck. "3 miracles," he whispered against her skin. "When they said my condition might make conception impossible." A knock at the door forced them apart. Kate entered looking apologetic but urgent. "Mr. President, the press is demanding a statement about the journal, and there are rumors about Ms. Salome being seen at a fertility clinic." Declan straightened, his presidential mask sliding back into place, but his hand found Megara's, holding tight. "Schedule a press conference," he said, his voice steady. "It's time to tell the truth. All of it." "Sir?" Kate's eyes widened. "Are you sure? No more shadows." He looked at Megara, his eyes full of love and determination. No more hiding. The next hour was a blur of preparation. Communication staff drafted statements while legal reviewed potential ramifications. Through it all, Declan kept Megara close, as if afraid she might disappear. Finally, they stood together in the press briefing room, facing a sea of cameras and hungry eyes. Declan stepped to the podium, his presence commanding despite the slight tremor in his hands. "Good afternoon. I've called this press conference to address recent revelations and to share some personal news." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "The journal entries released today were written by someone who didn't know me. Someone who saw only the persona I cultivated as president. That person was right about many things. I was harsh, demanding, often cruel. But people can change. Love can change them." Murmurs rippled through the press corps as he continued. "Yes, I fell in love with my deputy policy director. Yes, we're expecting children, triplets in fact." Gasps and camera clicks filled the room. "And yes, I'm dying. I have a terminal condition that will take my life within 2 years, but these facts aren't scandals to be exposed. They're truths to be shared." Megara stepped forward to stand beside him, their hands clasping openly for the first time in public. The cameras went wild. "Ms. Salome's early impressions of me were accurate," Declan continued. "I was a man focused solely on power and legacy. She taught me there are more important things, like love, like family, like using the time we have to make real change." Questions erupted from the reporters, but Declan raised his hand for silence. "Judge us by our actions, not by words written in anger months ago. Judge us by the hospitals we've saved, the lives we've changed, the work we continue to do. As for our personal life..." He smiled down at Megara, his love evident for all to see. "Some things are worth any price." The press conference devolved into chaos after that, but they held firm together, answering questions with quiet dignity. When they finally escaped to the Oval Office, exhausted but unbowed, Declan pulled Megara into his arms. "3 babies," he murmured against her hair. "I never dreamed." "Believe it," she said, placing his hand on her stomach again. "They're fighters, like their father." "Like their mother," he corrected, kissing her softly. "The woman who wasn't afraid to call me heartless to my face." She laughed, despite the tears in her eyes. "I take it back. You have too much heart, if anything." Outside, the media storm raged. Their phones buzzed constantly with reactions and requests. The political landscape was shifting beneath their feet. But in that moment, holding each other in the quiet of the Oval Office, none of it mattered. They had weathered the exposure of past pain and emerged stronger. They had 3 tiny miracles growing beneath her heart. The future was uncertain, time was limited, but they would face it all together. No more shadows, no more hiding. Just love, purpose, and the promise of new life tripling their joy. Chapter 9. Truth and Consequences. The morning after their public revelation, the White House lawn bloomed with a sea of reporters and camera crews. Inside, Megara watched the coverage from Declan's private study, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. Presidential romance, a modern love story. Triplets in the White House, a historic pregnancy. Terminal diagnosis. President Oscar's battle against time. The headlines scrolled endlessly across every network. Some were sympathetic, painting their relationship as a tragic romance. Others were more cynical, suggesting political manipulation and questioning the timing of everything. "You should be resting," Declan's voice came from behind her. He moved to stand beside her chair, his hand finding her shoulder. "So should you," she countered, noting the shadows under his eyes. Neither of them had slept much. The door opened, admitting Kate with a stack of newspapers and polling data. "Sir, ma'am, you'll want to see these." The initial polling showed a surprising trend. While conservative outlets called for impeachment and traditional Republicans expressed outrage, the general public was largely supportive. Their honesty about Declan's condition, combined with the unexpected pregnancy, had humanized him in ways years of political maneuvering never had. "They're calling it the president's last love," Kate reported, handing them the Washington Post. "The healthcare initiatives are getting more attention too. People are connecting your personal story to the policy." "Of course they are," Declan mused, his thumb tracing circles on Megara's shoulder. "Nothing motivates healthcare reform like a dying president and a high-risk pregnancy." "Declan," Megara started, but he squeezed her shoulder gently. "It's okay. We might as well use it to our advantage." He turned to Kate. "Schedule a series of hospital visits. Let's show people exactly what we're fighting for." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of public appearances and private doctor's appointments. Megara's pregnancy became increasingly difficult to hide, her normally slim frame already showing signs of carrying triplets. Dr. Chen insisted on weekly checkups, concerned about the stress levels of a high-profile pregnancy. "Blood pressure's a bit high," she noted during one visit. "You need to reduce your workload." But reducing work wasn't simple when you were helping run the country. The healthcare initiative was entering its critical phase, with implementation deadlines looming and opposition mounting in Congress. One afternoon, during a particularly heated Senate committee meeting, Megara felt a sharp pain that made her gasp. Declan, who had been testifying about healthcare funding, stopped mid-sentence. "Clear the room," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Once they were alone, he was at her side instantly. "What's wrong?" "Just cramping," she assured him, though her face was pale. "Dr. Chen said it's normal with triplets." He wasn't convinced. "We're going to the hospital. We can't just leave a Senate hearing. Watch me." Within minutes, his security detail had orchestrated their exit. The media went wild with speculation, but Declan remained focused solely on Megara as doctors ran tests and checked on the babies. "Everything looks stable," Dr. Chen assured them later. "But this is a warning. Ms. Salome needs complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. Declan's face set in familiar lines of determination. "Done." "We have the healthcare vote coming up," Megara protested. "The implementation timeline can be handled by others." He took her hand, his voice softening. "Please, Megara. For them. For me." She looked at him then. Really looked. Behind the mask of presidential authority, she saw fear, raw and deep. He'd already lost his sister to a broken healthcare system. The thought of losing her or their babies. "Okay," she whispered. 2 weeks. The next day, the White House announced that Deputy Policy Director Megara Salome would be taking medical leave due to pregnancy complications. The press exploded with theories and concerns, but for once, they didn't care about the coverage. Declan moved Megara into the private residence, converting one of the sitting rooms into a comfortable workspace where she could rest while staying involved in policy discussions. He rearranged his schedule to spend evenings with her, going over briefings and sharing meals. It was during one of these evenings that she noticed his hands shaking more than usual as he reached for his water glass. "The medication isn't working as well," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." He set the glass down carefully. "Dr. Mitchell wants to try a new combination." "Why didn't you tell me? You have enough to worry about." He gestured to her growing belly. 3 very active worries, from what I can see." As if on cue, one of the babies kicked. Declan's face lit up as he felt the movement under his palm. "They're strong," he murmured, "like their mother. Like both of us." She covered his hand with hers. "We're all fighting together." The moment was interrupted by an urgent knock. Vice President Warner entered, looking grave. "Sir, the opposition has the votes. They're going to block the healthcare funding." Declan's face hardened, but before he could respond, Megara struggled to sit up, straighter. "Get me my laptop," she said, "and call Marcus. We're going to rewrite this narrative." "You're supposed to be resting," Declan protested. "I am resting. I'm just going to rest while orchestrating a major media campaign about how the opposition is threatening the healthcare of unborn presidential children." Both men stared at her. "That's brilliant," Warner said finally, "and slightly terrifying." "Welcome to my world," Declan murmured, but his eyes shone with pride. The next week saw a massive shift in public opinion. Pictures of Megara's hospital stay leaked, carefully orchestrated by Marcus, showing the president keeping vigil by her bedside. Stories about triplet pregnancy risks and healthcare access dominated the news cycle. The funding vote passed by a comfortable margin. "You're a political genius," Declan told her that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over their growing children. "Ruthless, but genius." "I learned from the best." She turned to face him, tracing the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "How are you really feeling?" He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Scared, hopeful, grateful, sometimes all at once." "Me too." They held each other in the darkness, feeling the babies move between them. Outside, the world continued to spin with politics and scandals and speculation. Inside, they had created their own universe, one where love outweighed duty, where hope defied probability, and where their remaining time together stretched out like an endless promise. The future was uncertain, filled with medical challenges and political battles, but they had each other, they had their babies, and for now, that was enough. Let tomorrow bring what it would. Tonight, they were complete. Chapter 10. Lightning Strikes. The White House rose garden had never looked more beautiful. Spring flowers bloomed in carefully orchestrated profusion, their scent carrying on the gentle May breeze. Megara stood before a mirror in the blue room, her wedding dress carefully modified to accommodate her 5-month pregnant form. The triplets made their presence known with a series of kicks. "Easy in there," she murmured, smoothing a hand over her prominent belly. "Your father's nervous enough already." Kate appeared in the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright. "He's asking for you. Says he needs to see you before the ceremony. Bad luck to see the bride. Since when have you two followed conventional rules?" Megara smiled, remembering every broken protocol and shattered precedent that had led to this moment. "Where is he?" She found Declan in the Oval Office, standing at his familiar window. He turned at her entrance, and the look on his face made her heart stop. "You're beautiful," he whispered. The tremor in his hands was worse today, emotion amplifying the symptoms of his condition. But his eyes were clear and bright as he crossed to take her hands. "I needed to give you something," he said softly, "before we do this publicly." From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn velvet box. Inside was a simple pearl ring. "It was my mother's," he explained. "And her mother's before that. Sarah was supposed to have it, but—" He swallowed hard. "I want you to wear it today. Under your wedding ring. Something old, something private just for us." Tears threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup as he slipped the pearl ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I love you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the emotions swelling in her chest. "Even when I'm impossible. Especially then." Their kiss was gentle, mindful of her makeup and his precarious balance. When they separated, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Ready to scandalize the nation one more time?" he asked with a ghost of his old smirk. "Lead the way, Mr. President." The ceremony itself was a blur of flowers and flashbulbs. The media had been allowed limited access, a concession to transparency that turned their private moment into a public spectacle. But as they exchanged vows beneath the blooming roses, Megara saw only Declan's face, felt only his hands holding hers with careful strength. The reception that followed was carefully orchestrated to minimize his fatigue and accommodate her pregnancy restrictions. They managed one dance, slow and sweet, before retiring to the private residence. "Mrs. Oscar," he murmured against her hair as they swayed together in their bedroom, continuing their private dance. "Doctor." "Salome Oscar," she corrected with a smile. "I'm keeping my name professionally." "Of course you are." His hand splayed protectively over her belly. "Strong and independent, just like—" A sharp gasp cut off his words as Megara doubled over in sudden pain. "Megara!" The fear in his voice was raw. "Something's wrong," she managed through clenched teeth. "The babies." What followed was a nightmare of motion and fear. Secret Service agents clearing. Corridors. Doctors being summoned. Declan's face growing paler with each passing minute. In the hospital, monitors beeped urgent warnings as Dr. Chen examined her with growing concern. "The stress of the wedding." She shook her head. "There's placental disruption. We need to operate now." "It's too early," Megara protested weakly. "They're not ready. They'll have to be." Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. President, we need your consent as next of kin." Declan's hand tightened on Megara's. "Save them, all of them." But before they could move her to surgery, his secure phone buzzed with the tone that meant absolute emergency. "Sir," Agent Thompson appeared in the doorway. "Nuclear situation developing in Eastern Europe. Joint Chiefs are requesting immediate authorization for defensive protocols." The world seemed to stop. Megara saw the agony on Declan's face as duty warred with love. "Go!" she whispered. "Save the world. I'll keep our family safe." He kissed her desperately, his hands framing her face. "I love you. All of you." Then he was gone, rushing to prevent one crisis while his heart remained in a hospital room where another crisis unfolded. The surgery was delicate and dangerous. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize the triplets while managing Megara's complications. In the White House Situation Room, Declan navigated international tensions with one eye on his phone, waiting for updates. Hours passed in a haze of fear and hope. Finally, as dawn broke over Washington, two crises resolved almost simultaneously. "Nuclear forces standing down," reported the Secretary of Defense. "All 3 babies stable," texted Dr. Chen. "Mother in recovery." Declan's legs nearly gave out with relief. The Vice President took one look at his face and took command. "Go," Warner said softly. "Be with your family. I'll handle the aftermath here." He reached the hospital in record time, his security detail breaking every traffic law in D.C. He found Megara pale but awake in recovery, monitors showing 4 strong heartbeats, hers and their 3 miracles. "They're so small," she whispered as he sank into the chair beside her bed. "But fighting," he assured her, his trembling fingers finding hers, "just like their mother." "Did you prevent nuclear war?" He laughed softly, the sound half sob. "Yes, though it was considerably less terrifying than waiting for news about you 4. Some wedding night. Never dull with us, is it?" They held each other as morning light filled the hospital room. Their world narrowed to the steady beep of monitors and the miracle of survival. Outside, the media was already spinning stories, the dramatic rush from wedding to hospital, the president balancing international crisis with personal emergency. But inside their quiet room, none of that mattered. They had fought impossible odds and won. 4 hearts kept beating. 3 tiny lives kept growing, and love continued to defy every shadow that tried to darken it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in the gentle light of dawn, they held on to their miracle with both hands. Chapter 11. After the Storm. The summer heat lay heavy over Washington as Declan prepared for the hardest speech of his life. Megara watched from her hospital bed as the makeup team tried to conceal the increasing signs of his condition. 7 months into her high-risk pregnancy, she hadn't left the hospital since their wedding day crisis. "The tremors are more noticeable," the lead makeup artist said quietly. "We can minimize them on camera, but I can't hide it anymore," Declan finished. He looked at Megara, his arctic eyes carrying a storm of emotions. It's time. The decision to publicly announce his condition had come after his collapse during a G7 summit last week. The footage of the President of the United States stumbling during his speech had gone viral, sparking endless speculation. "The people deserve to know," he'd said afterward, holding Megara's hand in her hospital room. "They need to understand why certain decisions are being made, why we're pushing so hard for healthcare reform." Now, as the TV crew set up their equipment in the hospital's private wing, Megara could see the cost of this decision written in the lines of his face. "Come here," she said softly. He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, his hand automatically finding her swollen belly where their triplets moved restlessly. "Whatever happens after this," she began, "I know." He managed a ghost of his old smile. "We face it together." The babies kicked against his palm, as if affirming their parents' resolve. The medical team had been amazed by their development. 3 strong heartbeats, 3 distinct personalities already making themselves known through their movements. "Aurora's doing somersaults again," Declan murmured, feeling a particularly energetic motion, "while Leo and Phoenix play soccer with my ribs." Megara smiled despite her discomfort. They'd chosen the names weeks ago. Aurora for the dawn they hoped their healthcare reforms would bring, Leo for the strength they'd need in the days ahead, and Phoenix for the legacy that would rise from their shared sacrifice. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Marcus Chen entered, looking grave. "Sir, we're ready. The networks are standing by for the live feed." Declan nodded, squeezing Megara's hand one last time before moving to the prepared setting. They'd chosen to do the broadcast from the hospital suite, letting the American people see both their president's vulnerability and his dedication to family. The red light blinked on, and Declan Oscar, President of the United States, began his most personal address to the nation. "My fellow Americans," he started, his voice steady, despite the visible tremor in his hands. "Tonight, I speak to you not just as your president, but as a man facing his own mortality. 7 months ago, I announced that I was battling an illness. Today, I want to be completely transparent about the nature and progression of that condition." Megara watched as he detailed his diagnosis, the prognosis, the treatments he'd undergone. His voice remained strong, though she could see the cost in the tightness around his eyes. "Hartman's disease is terminal," he continued. "The doctors estimate I have approximately 12 to 18 months of functional capacity remaining. I tell you this not to seek sympathy, but because you deserve to know the full truth about your president's health." He paused, gathering strength before the most crucial part of his speech. "Some will call for my resignation. They will say a dying man cannot effectively lead our nation. To them, I say, it is precisely because I am dying that I must continue to serve. Every policy I've championed, every reform I've fought for, comes from first-hand understanding of our healthcare system's failures." The camera panned slightly to include Megara in the shot, showing the personal stakes of their healthcare battle. "My wife, Dr. Megara Salome Oscar, carries our 3 children, miracles made possible by the very medical advances we're fighting to make accessible to all Americans. She lies in this hospital because every pregnancy with triplets is high risk, requiring constant medical supervision that too many families cannot afford." His voice grew stronger, carrying the passion that had first drawn Megara to him. "I will not resign. I will not step aside. I will use every day I have left to ensure that no American has to choose between medical care and feeding their family. No parent should watch their child die because they can't afford treatment. No spouse should face bankruptcy because their loved one got sick. Tears streamed down Megara's face as he continued, his words painting a vision of the future they'd fought so hard to create. Suddenly, a sharp pain ripped through her abdomen. She tried to hide her gasp, not wanting to interrupt his speech, but her monitor's sudden beeping betrayed her. Declan broke off mid-sentence, turning to her with naked fear in his eyes. "Megara?" Dr. Chen burst into the room, quickly assessing the situation. "The babies are coming. Now." The live feed cut off abruptly, leaving millions of Americans hanging as their president rushed to his wife's side. What followed was a blur of activity and emotion. Medical teams swarmed the room, preparing for an emergency C-section. Declan refused to leave, even when his hands shook so badly he could barely sign the consent forms. "Stay with me," Megara whispered as they wheeled her into surgery. "Always." The operation was delicate, complicated by the triplets' position and Megara's weakened condition. Declan held her hand throughout, his own medical challenges forgotten in the face of his family's crisis. At 9:47 p.m., Aurora Michelle Oscar announced her arrival with a strong cry that brought tears to her father's eyes. At 9:49 p.m., Leonardo James Oscar followed his sister, smaller but fighting. At 9:52 p.m., Phoenix William Oscar completed their miracle, his tiny hand gripping his father's finger with surprising strength. "They're perfect," Declan whispered, his voice choked with emotion as the nurses cleaned and evaluated each baby. "You're perfect." The news of the triplets' birth broke across the nation like a wave of hope. Media outlets that had been preparing to call for the president's resignation found themselves running split screens of his powerful speech and updates on the baby's condition. Public support surged as Americans watched their president balance his duties with his role as a new father. Pictures of him holding all three babies while conducting official business from the hospital went viral. 2 days after the births, Declan addressed the nation again, this time with his family beside him. "Life," he said, cradling Phoenix while Megara held Aurora and Leo, "is full of unexpected challenges and unprecedented joys. These 3 miracle babies remind us why we fight, why we push for change, why we never give up, even when the odds seem impossible." The image became iconic. The dying president, his brave wife, and their 3 tiny fighters, all defying probability and prejudice to change the world. In their private moments, between feedings and policy meetings, Declan and Megara marveled at their children's distinct personalities already emerging. Aurora, born first and biggest, seemed to watch everything with her father's Arctic blue eyes and her mother's determination. Leo, quieter but intense, fought every challenge with a strength that belied his size. Phoenix, the smallest but most alert, already showed signs of both parents' intelligence and spirit. "They're going to change the world," Declan murmured one night, watching them sleep in their hospital bassinets. "They already have," Megara replied, seeing how their story had transformed the healthcare debate, how their journey had touched millions. The road ahead would be hard. Declan's condition continued to progress, each day bringing new challenges. But as they held their 3 miracles, as they watched the nation rally around their cause, they knew every battle had been worth it. Love had transformed them both, from adversaries to allies, from political opponents to partners, from individuals to family. Now that love would become their legacy, living on in 3 tiny hearts that beat with all their parents' strength and determination. The storm had passed, leaving behind not destruction, but new life, new hope, and a future brighter than either of them had dared to dream. Chapter 12. Shadows into Light. Winter came early to Washington that year, dusting the White House grounds with snow that glittered like diamonds in the December sun. Declan stood at his familiar window in the Oval Office, watching 6-month-old Aurora take her first tentative steps in the rose garden, supported by Megara's steady hands. Leo and Phoenix crawled nearby, determined to keep up with their sister. His hands shook badly now, even with increased medication, but his mind remained sharp. Dr. Mitchell had called it a miracle that he'd maintained his faculties this long. Declan called it love and stubbornness in equal measure. The door opened softly behind him. "The final healthcare bill is ready for your signature," Kate said, her voice gentle. She'd been with them through everything, her loyalty unwavering. "Bring it in." The signing ceremony was intimate, just family and key staff. His hands trembled so much that Megara had to help steady them as he signed the most comprehensive healthcare reform bill in American history. The cameras caught the moment, not as a sign of weakness, but as a testament to their partnership. "For Sarah," he whispered as he finished the last letter, "for everyone's Sarah." That evening, as snow fell softly outside, they gathered in the private residence. The triplets were a whirlwind of activity, Aurora already showing signs of her father's leadership, organizing her brothers in what looked suspiciously like policy meetings with their stuffed animals. Leo, quiet but determined, built towers of blocks with impressive focus. Phoenix, the dreamer, watched the snow with his father's Arctic blue eyes, pointing excitedly at each falling flake. "Tell me again," Megara said softly, curled against him on the sofa. "Tell them how we met." Declan smiled, gathering his children close. It was a stormy morning in the White House, and this brilliant, beautiful woman walked into my office and changed everything. He told them the story of their journey, edited for young ears but full of love and hope. How two people who started as opponents became partners, then lovers, then a family. How their mother's courage and their father's determination had changed a nation. As he spoke, his voice grew weaker, but his eyes remained bright with joy and pride. The children, sensing something important, stayed unusually still. "Your mother," he said, looking at Megara with all the love in his heart, "taught me that real strength isn't about power or position. It's about having the courage to love, to change, to fight for what matters." Aurora climbed into his lap, her tiny hand touching his cheek. "Love you, Daddy." The words, still new from her, broke something open in his heart. Leo and Phoenix joined their sister, creating a cocoon of warmth and love around their parents. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Declan and Megara danced slowly in their bedroom, his increasingly unsteady steps supported by her strength. "I need you to promise me something," he murmured against her hair. "Anything. Don't let them forget that love can change the world. That's our real legacy, not the policies or the reforms, but the proof that love can bridge any divide, heal any heart, create miracles. They'll know," she promised, tears falling freely now. "Every day they'll know." His condition deteriorated rapidly after that night, but even as his body failed, his love seemed to grow stronger. He spent every moment he could with his family, recording videos for future birthdays, writing letters for milestones he wouldn't see. The end came peacefully on a bright spring morning. Megara held him as he watched one last sunrise, their children sleeping peacefully nearby. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice faint but clear. "For what?" "For giving me everything, love, family, purpose, hope." His Arctic eyes found hers, still sharp with intelligence and devotion. "Keep changing the world, my love. Keep fighting. Keep hoping." "I will," she promised. "We will." His last smile was radiant with joy and peace. The nation mourned, but Megara kept her promise. She established the Oscar Foundation for Healthcare Innovation, using their story to inspire continued reform. The triplets grew into remarkable individuals, each carrying a piece of their father's legacy. Aurora became a force in healthcare policy, her father's commanding presence tempered by her mother's compassion. Leo channeled his quiet strength into medical research, finding new ways to fight diseases like the one that took his father. Phoenix became a storyteller, keeping his father's memory alive through words that touched hearts and changed minds. On the 10th anniversary of the healthcare bill's signing, Megara stood in the rose garden with her children, now old enough to understand the full weight of their parents' journey. "Your father," she told them, "believed that love was the most powerful force in the universe, strong enough to change hearts, heal wounds, break down walls." He was right. She looked up at the White House, remembering every moment, from that first contentious meeting to their final sunrise. "Sometimes the greatest shadows," she said softly, "lead us to the brightest light." Above them, cherry blossoms danced in the spring breeze, their petals catching the sunlight like falling stars. In that moment, she could almost feel Declan's presence. In Aurora's determined stance, in Leo's thoughtful gaze, in Phoenix's dreamer's heart. Their love story had become legend, studied in history books and political sciences classes, but the real magic wasn't in the policies they'd changed or the barriers they'd broken. It was in the quiet moments, a dying man teaching his son to tie a tie through video recordings, a mother telling bedtime stories about a president who learned to love, 3 children growing up knowing they were born from a love strong enough to change the world. In the end, that was Declan Oscar's greatest legacy. Not the bills he'd signed or the reforms he'd championed, but the proof that love could transform shadows into light, pain into purpose, endings into new beginnings. And in the hearts of those he left behind, that light would shine forever. Subscribe if you liked.